Right, well, there's quite a lot to cover in this talk, so I'll quickly just go through what I intend to try and cover. I'm going to start off by hopefully kind of trying to recap on the summary of the last meeting in terms of Hegel's dialectic, before I move on to talk about how Marx developed that dialectic, and then following Marx, how Lenin and then Lukacs in turn developed the dialectic. Okay. So I suppose, first of all, we need to kind of consider a question that I personally, at least, kind of considered when, as someone that's interested in philosophy and that considers myself a Marxist, how compatible are Marxism and philosophy? Because philosophy has mainly concerned itself over history with two major problems. What is the nature of existence and being, and how can we arrive at knowledge of this? And this is obviously some of the kind of themes that was dealt with in the previous meeting. The question of whether Marxism is a philosophy or contains a philosophical basis to it is a question that the socialist movement has attempted to grapple with as well for the last 100 years.
It's on.
Yeah? Apologies, I'll speak clearer. Yep.
It's quite hard, isn't it? Perhaps that's better.
Okay. So people will probably all know about Marx's famous pronouncement in the 11th thesis on Feuerbach that the philosophers have hitherto interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. So that would seem to suggest to us that philosophy is something that has been replaced by practical questions. I'd like to suggest that actually this is a fundamental mistaken idea of Marx and his relationship to philosophy, and indeed the great tradition of Marxists that followed him. What Marxism actually rejects is the concept of theory as something purely intellectual, as a dispute between theoreticians only. And as the great philosopher Trotsky noted, Marx appealed from philosophy to the proletarian revolution, not against philosophy, but for it. Okay. And in the 19th century, the Russian theorist Alexander Herzen described the dialectic as the algebra of revolution. But what I'd like to try and argue throughout this meeting is that doesn't mean that there's a formula or an abstract formula that we can see the dialectic as representing, and that we just need to put this onto society. Indeed, Hegel insists on reminding us that dialectic is not a set of universal rules that we need to come to terms with before we can understand the world. Neither is it a kind of magic wand that will elicit knowledge for us. It's actually quite a hard labour that we have to perform on the world to try and grasp knowledge about it. And fundamentally, it expresses the logic of change. Okay. So people might have heard Marxists describe capitalism as something that is full of contradictions, and I hope to try and explain what that apparently bizarre statement means, because it took me a long time to try and kind of understand how society can be contradictory, but it's with the dialectic that we can begin to understand how indeed society is full of dialectical contradictions. You carry on. Okay. So to just try and think about Marx's philosophy, although Marx didn't use either phrase himself, his philosophy and his theory of society has been termed dialectical materialism or historical materialism, and I think both of these are quite good descriptions of Marx's project. So to consider the second half of that first, materialism. Marx's philosophy is materialist because it first of all it accepts the fundamental premise that human beings are a part of nature, and secondly, that the world is independent of our ideas about it. That doesn't mean that we can't come to understand the world, but it means that the world existed prior to us, and it's not a result of our conscious ideas. And it's the concept of practice that we'll begin to see that kind of mediates these two things together. So, for example, to consider the example of racism, Marxists would understand racism as something that arises on the basis of slavery and imperialism and as a justification for it. It's not racist ideas first in people's heads that then leads to slavery and imperialism. But Marx's materialism is not of a deterministic kind that views human ideas and human beings simply as the consequences of this thing called the economy or of economic structures that are seen to be developing towards a predetermined goal outside of human activity. Rather, Marx's materialism was dialectical, precisely because history was understood to develop through contradiction and struggle between opposed social forces. And it is on that basis, it's because of it's the dialectical materialism that we can see that ideas actually interact through the world through human practice. So our ideas both shape the world but are shaped by the world. And that Marx came to understand history as a history of class struggle between opposed social forces. History is not simply some mechanical thing developing outside of us, nor is it a subjectivist or idealist thing such as Hegel understood history being the process of ideas changing. Marx kind of transcends both of those, I would argue. And here's a quote that I think kind of summarises that for Marx. He wrote this in the 18th Brumaire, so that's in 1852, and he said, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living." So you can kind of see that interrelation between the past, the present, and the future. And if we're going to think about how we can change society in the future, we need to understand how we've got here now and the particular social forces that we're working with now. So briefly, I'd like to recap on Hegel's Dialectic, which was talked about in the meeting previous to this, and I hope that if you weren't in that meeting, you can buy the CD and kind of try to see how Hegel's Dialectic arose out of the tradition of German idealism. So we can understand that Hegel's Dialectic contested all the previous form of thinking summarised by many different philosophers, but just to choose one, I'll take Bishop Butler, who said that everything is what it is and is not another thing. So this is what is known as the principle of non-contradiction that has been adhered to by philosophers for centuries. And it sounds obviously logical to say that. That would seem to be what founds all of our knowledge about anything. So to say that this lectern here, it is this lectern, we need to understand the world if we're going to act on it, that's of course true. But what Hegel would say is that to take the immediate appearance of reality, so to say that this thing here is what it is an abstract and immediate form of knowledge. So what seems to be most concrete, what seems to be most visible and tangible is actually most abstract. And for Hegel, he would say that this is harbouring a contradiction already, because to say what something is to say that it is not something else. So there's a negation there within your definition, okay? So you're saying this is this, therefore it's not X, Y, or Z. So to know this thing dialectically, so to know this piece of wood here dialectically, would be to see it as part of a process. So this once was a tree and it will eventually become dust. So we need to grasp things as part of a process and as part of a historical process. And that one stage of this is internally contradictory or negated by the next. But that's an internal contradiction to it. It's not the result of external things changing it. Okay. So for Hegel, and this is what I think Marx kind of took, and Lukacs as well, is that things must be grasped in their becoming and not as separate, static, or permanent. And it was in his own time that Hegel's theory was deemed to be dangerous because it dared to assert that everything contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. Although ultimately, of course, as was talked about in the last meeting, Hegel did understand contradictions, at least within society, as being mediated. So he didn't see contradictions as things that were fundamentally irreconcilable. So, for example, between civil society and the monarchy, Hegel thought that these two things that were opposed to one another could be mediated by the state. So you could put something in between them, what he called a mediation, which would mediate that contradiction rather than transcending it. And I think, as I'll go to show, that's Marx completely changes that idea of contradiction and mediation. Okay. So Marx's dialectical philosophy starts from the recognition that human beings are beings of praxis. They actively create and engage with their world. It's from this insight that Marx overcame the stumbling block of all the prior philosophers, and especially Hegel, who tried to express the insight that human beings could have practical knowledge about the world, but expressed this either by separating man's doing from his thinking, as we saw with Hegel, or by generalising as eternal human beings' existence as competing solitary individuals under capitalism. And it is on this basis that Marx criticises and praises Hegel. Hegel grasps labour as the essence of man, as man's essence in the act of proving itself. He sees only the positive, not the negative side of labour. So for Hegel, labour, he grasps labour and activity as an essential way that we can understand knowledge. So in the previous discussion we talked about how Kant couldn't really overcome the distinction between the thing in itself and our knowledge of it. For Hegel, it is the fact that there is that for Hegel it's thought that has produced the outside world in the first place, see? So it's thought coming to realise that it has produced the outside world, that the outside world is something external to it and it needs to bring it back into itself. But for Marx, that notion of alienation is not the same as objectification. So human beings need to objectify themselves in the world, but under capitalism, our labour takes a particular form that is alienated. So history for Hegel was the successive manifestation of ideas, or what Hegel called the world spirit arriving at true knowledge through the struggle of these ideas. One philosophical system would break down through its internal contradictions and be replaced by another until Hegel's philosophy itself expressed true knowledge. Human beings therefore appear through the back door of history because it is not the self-development of man that makes history, but the self-development of the idea. So Marx says that he's only grasped the movement of history abstractly and in an alienated manner. Okay. So Marx took from Hegel the central principle of dialectics, which I think we can understand as movement and development occurring through contradiction, and he tried to analyse history on this basis. So history for Marx is a series of modes of production. So you'll see in his works he kind of analyses ancient society, feudalism and capitalism on the basis that within them there is a unity of opposites. And on the one hand, you've got the forces of production, which includes the means of production and all the technology that goes into how we produce, and the relations of production. So that's the social relations that structure a given society at a certain time. And these can exist in apparent stability for centuries, but they have to be understood to be held together by this unity of opposites underneath them. And at certain points in history, we can understand that changes in the forces of production can run up against the limits of the dominant relations of production. So, for example, in the run-up to the French Revolution, the new forces of production represented by the nascent capitalist class came into contradiction with the old relations of production, the power of landed property and the feudal lord. And by Marx's time, the order of capital was plunging into crisis and destruction. And it is just at this time that Marx begins to see that the proletariat acts as an independent force in history, because no longer could, as soon as the proletariat as a class begin to act against capital, in order to defend their own existence, the bourgeois class ceases to be a revolutionary class, and this is what the revolutions of 1848 symbolise, because their ideals of equality and liberty fail to live up to what they profess, when the reality of capitalism is a completely dehumanising one. And ultimately because the capital relation depends on being able to commodify and control labour. And it is this central contradiction between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat that structures all the contradictions of capitalism. So we have on the one hand immense wealth depends on extreme poverty, that scientific knowledge is used to create through technology wonderful machines, but these machines don't lighten labour, they are antithetical to human beings, and when they are used to change the labour process, it results in vast numbers of us being thrown onto the dole queues. And I think most presciently we can see, for example, on the one hand, the acknowledgement and the drive to improve the environment is wedded to the most absurd wastefulness of resources that man has ever known. And people may be familiar with the struggles that happened a couple of years ago over on the Isle of Wight, where you had the Vestas occupation. So this was a factory that produced wind turbines, or some kind of thing that went onto wind turbines, which is the kind of technology that we need to be obviously investing in, given the quite obvious concerns with climate change that capitalism is producing. but that factory was actually shut down because it wasn't deemed to be profitable enough. So the workers actually occupied that factory on the basis that we needed to keep this thing going. But you can see that actually where the relations of production there, where something isn't deemed to be profitable enough, it's let to go to waste. So, this is the kind of thing that Marx was kind of trying to express. There's a contradiction here between our capacity to produce and how this is geared towards profit instead of need. And he says that this turns every economic progress into a social calamity. So unlike Hegel's, the materialist dialectic grasps the actual contradiction between classes as a struggle between two irreconcilable forces. Okay, thank you. Right, okay. So I suppose we need to kind of try to understand why it was that the proletariat, first of all, arose as an independent force, and how Marx kind of tried to theorise why they did and why they were the solution to the contradictions of capital, I suppose. Because this insight didn't just come around because Marx discovered this thing called the dialectic in Hegel and then applied it to society as an abstract tool, but it's because he actually witnessed the activity of workers against a system that dehumanised their very existence, forcing them to work harder and longer and cyclically throwing them into poverty and unemployment. And Marx does this first of all in 1844 when the Silesian weavers actually begin strikes, and I think that's an area in Germany, between Germany and France, and he says in 1844 the Silesian uprising began where the French and English insurrection ended, with the consciousness of the proletariat as a class. So I think what we can see there is that it's actually the conditions of society that have enabled the proletariat to arise as an independent force. Okay. So Marx held that philosophy and ideas play a vital role in self-emancipation, but theory had to be grounded in the real dynamics of reality. Theories and philosophies arise from the material production of life, but they are not mechanically determined in a one-way fashion from the material production of life. And it is with Marxism, I suppose, Marxism is trying to generalise the consciousness of the proletariat and trying to generalise this theory that understands the proletariat as a new force in society, capable of overthrowing capitalism. And it is in that theory no longer is an intellectual thing, I think. And it becomes a weapon in the class struggle. So theory is in dialectical interaction with practice in that sense. Okay, and I think more than that also, Marx used dialectical theory to get to the heart of the matter when he was trying to analyse capitalist society. Because I think one of the main objections you find about the dialectic is that it's a schema for understanding history. It's actually a way of not looking at concrete reality and actually trying to understand the facts of the matter. But when we actually look at how Marx applied this in Capital, I think that we can see how you need to relate the most concrete thing that you can see to the totality and to the process as a whole. So he starts by taking capitalism as it appears, and he says that this appears as an accumulation of commodities, things to be bought and sold. So the market is therefore the mechanism through which we produce for one another, but because our products take the form of commodities, it's the commodities that exchange, and that they appear to have the social relation between them and not the producers. So in that sense, capitalism is a mystified system. You don't see, just by looking at it at the level of appearance, what is actually going on there. It just appears to be a marketplace where you buy and sell. I sell my labour power to the capitalist who gives me a wage. And Marx says that it's only when you take that analysis to a deeper level, to the point of production, and show how our labour power, once you get into the point of production, when you're sent into the factory or into the call centre or whatever, and you're put to work, that there is actually a struggle over your work, because to the capitalist and to the class of capital, their whole existence depends on extracting value from your labour. So our labour actually becomes a commodity under capitalist society, and therefore that's why there's a struggle over labour power, which we experience as a struggle over our whole existence. You know, the system's trying to make us work harder for longer and for less. But for the capitalist class, that is also a necessary part of their existence as well, because they need to create more and more profit. So they can't conceive of labour power as the person in that sense, I suppose. So, and this is how Marx describes his dialectic method in Capital, which has been argued by some people that Capital is an economic scientific text and it has nothing to do with dialectics, and I think that that's a fundamental mistaken view of what Marx was trying to do with Capital. And he says, in its mystified form, dialectic became the fashion in Germany because it seems to transfigure and to glorify the existing state of things. In its rational form, it is a scandal and abomination to bourgeoisdom and its doctrinaire professors, because it includes in its comprehension and affirmative recognition of the existing state of things, i.e., on the one hand it tries to understand society, at the same time also the recognition of the negation of that state, of its inevitable breaking up, because it regards every historically developed social form as in fluid movement, and therefore takes into account its transient nature not less than its momentary existence, because it lets nothing impose upon it, and is in its essence critical and revolutionary. So Capital, far from being a dry economic textbook as we would be led to believe, is full of the history of class struggle. And in Volume 1, for instance, the struggle over the working day is absolutely central to how Marx tried to analyse value, and all the way through Capital, from Volume 1 to Volume 3, this contradiction between labour and between labour as value is there all the way, underlying crisis. So capitalism is based on a growing division of labour, separating our intellectual capacity from our manual and physical capacity, but it can never completely destroy human beings as creative, active beings, because at the same time as capitalism destroys creativity and makes work dull and monotonous, it depends on human ingenuity too. So you can see that at the heart of Marx's Capital, he talks about how the labour process is this. A spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee puts to shame many an architect in the construction of her cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is this, that the architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality. At the end of every labour process, we get a result that already existed in the imagination of the labourer at its commencement. And you would never think that there was something such as that at the heart of this textbook, Capital. So that's why there is a contradiction at the heart of Capital between labour as this practical activity in the world and the form that it takes under Capital. Okay, and I think it's from this that we can begin to see how capitalism creates a force within itself that can potentially transcend it. Through understanding capitalism dialectically, Marx showed it to be inherently unstable and therefore something that we can change. Now I really need to move on to Lenin. Right then. So between the death of Marx in 1883 and Lenin's revisiting of dialectics at the beginning of World War I in 1914, there passed a period of time that can be described both as a high point for working class organisation, but a relatively low point for revolutionary theory and change. So you have these mass organisations being created in this period. The Socialist Party in Germany is no longer banned during this period, so it can actually begin to organise. This is also a period of expansion of capitalism and relative stability as well. And it's a reflection of this in the theories of the main socialist and what claims to be Marxist theories of the time. So, for example, Bernstein argues that crisis is now outdated, and that as a result, class struggle is something that will cease to be how the working class change society. What we need to focus on is reforms in parliament. And he thinks this because the objective existence of capitalism has changed, according to him. On the other hand, we have Kautsky, who, even in his critique of Bernstein, still argued that capitalism develops through the passive accumulation of forces. So what I think that what he kind of he's reasserting this division again between materialism and consciousness. So objective developments are something that don't really involve human consciousness. So our ideas and our theories just need to reflect the world, and so ultimately theory reflects reality. And he also too failed to understand the contradictions that underlied capitalist society, and he actually developed a theory called ultra-imperialism. And the understanding behind this was that obviously he's writing at a time when European society is divided amongst the nation states who are trying to carve up the rest of the world and exert their influence and colonise the rest of the world. And as we'll go on to see, Lenin completely disagreed with Kautsky's analysis, and Kautsky said that actually imperialism, if it developed to this ultra-imperialistic level, actually would negate the need for war, because it would bring countries and nation states closer together. So you can kind of see that there's absolutely no understanding of contradiction in the way that they understand society. It's just this kind of idea of the objective forces of society growing and growing and growing until ultimately and at the same time as that you've got the proletariat growing and growing until suddenly you apparently appear to have arrived at socialism in their kind of analysis. And ultimately this took its greatest form in the social democratic parties voting for war credits in 1914. So these parties actually went behind their respective national governments, and even that was done in a kind of deterministic way. So, for example, a lot of the theorists that defended the German war effort in 1914 from the Socialist Party argued that because we needed to oppose Russia, because the German socialist movement is bigger in Germany, it's more advanced in Germany than it is in Russia, so we need to defeat Russia in order to save socialism. A kind of bizarre understanding. And it was Lenin who turns to Hegel in 1914, and he reads the logic, and he writes this thing called the Philosophical Notebooks, and they're just his own personal notes, but you can get hold of them, and they're online on the Marxist.org website. And I think you can begin to see this massive transformation going on with Lenin, and he begins to reject the kind of vulgar materialist philosophy that dominated the socialist movement at this time, and he begins to espouse a dialectical relationship between theory and consciousness. So material reality doesn't simply shape consciousness, but actually consciousness interacts with material reality as well. And more than that, he also begins to analyse society as a contradictory totality. So it's not simply this thing on the other side of human beings, which is passively developing. It's a contradictory totality, and you can see that best in his analysis of imperialism. So Lenin says that imperialism is a new stage of capitalism. So on the one hand, it is discontinuous from capitalism, but on the other hand, it is continuous to capitalism because it's developing the contradictions of it even further. So there is a dialectic of continuity and discontinuity here. And that develops between imperialism, so between nation states. These contradictions sharpen, completely contrary, obviously, to what Kautsky kind of understood, in the Second World War being the proof of that. And also between imperialism and anti-imperialism, because a lot of the Marxists at the time kind of wrote off nationalism in the way that you kind of hear people writing off religion as something which is simply reactionary today. Nationalism then, by a lot of the Marxists, including people like Rosa Luxemburg, was deemed to be a reactionary force, whereas Lenin understood that anti-imperialist consciousness and movements were the polar opposite to the spread of imperialism, and therefore they were one way in which the imperialist state could be undermined. Therefore, they were the allies of revolutionary struggle, not the opposites to them. And that's why Lenin, for example, argued for the rights of oppressed minorities, and argued that socialists need to be supporting oppressed minorities, and the kind of nationalisms that you get in the form of anti-imperialism is not the same as the nationalism that you get in the imperialist countries. So the nationalism of the British is not the same as the nationalism of the Irish, for example. Okay. So it's a grasp of dialectics that enabled Lenin to hold to internationalism while recognising that the path to revolution went through national struggles against imperialism, and it's on this basis that we can comprehend 1917 as a verification of the dialectical movement of history. The Russian Revolution rubbed the stagist theory of history against the grain. So Plekhanov, who was, I suppose, Lenin's major influence before he turns to a more dialectical understanding of history, his first response to October 1917 is reported to have been, but it goes against all the laws of history. So instead of welcoming this event as the movement of the proletariat, it's something that goes against what they'd conceived to be the iron laws of development. And history for Lenin was not about the iron laws of development or waiting for power to drop like a ripe fruit through reforms. Is a process fraught with crisis and contradiction. Okay, I'm really going to move on to Lukacs now because I'm not sure how much time.
You've done 30 minutes.
Okay, wow, Lukacs in 5 minutes, this should be fun. Okay, so I hope that people will come in the discussion with more thoughts about Lukács as well. I know there was a meeting on it last night that I hope people went to. And I think that Lukács can really be seen as theorising the moment of 1917. 1917 opening up a new conjuncture in the socialist movement. It threw the mechanical stagist notion of history, it threw that away completely in practice by the fact of the revolution in Russia. And the aftershocks in the form of the short-lived revolutions in Germany and Hungary really did shape Lukács' understanding. This is someone that was a self-defined romantic anti-capitalist prior to 1917. So Lukács, you can see it in his early works, is kind of trying to grasp beyond the alienations of the capitalist system, but he can't find a force in which to ground this desire. So he turns to aesthetics and ethics initially as a way of kind of hoping beyond the system. But it's with 1917 that he actually sees in practice that there is a force within capitalist society that can transform it from within. And his work, History and Class Consciousness, which was a series of essays published in 1923, have been described as the philosophical moment of 1917. And the main problem that I think Lukács is dealing with, because he's dealing with the revolution on the one hand, but he's also seen the failure of the revolution to spread. I mean, it did spread, but ultimately it was defeated in Germany and Hungary, and ultimately isolated in Russia as well. So what Lukács is trying to grasp, really, is the problem of consciousness. And often, I suppose, I've read this more in kind of secondary reading about Marxist theory of consciousness than I have in Marx, but it's characterised as either conceiving of consciousness as something that's subject to ideology, so it's a mechanical kind of relationship between the fact that the media and the church and things like this kind of shape workers' consciousness. And of course that is true to an extent. These institutions do exist and they do pump out a particular form of ideology. Or on the other hand, there's an analysis of workers' consciousness as something that is subject to false consciousness. And I would suggest that that's kind of a more idealist reading of how consciousness develops. It's simply that people have simply got the wrong ideas in their head. And what Lukács is trying to do is to try to understand why it is that consciousness is shaped the way that it is. And he tries to find this logic in the objective reality. And he turns to what I spoke about earlier with Marx's analysis of commodity fetishism in Capital. And he tries to understand how it is that actually capital commodifies labour. It commodifies us as human beings. It commodifies what should be our active relationship to the world into something alien to us. So the active subject of history, as we would understand it at revolutionary moments, is transformed into an object. And Lukács actually says that the section on commodity fetishism in Capital contains within it all of historical materialism. Okay. So that's my notes. And what Lukács kind of tries to understand is because there is an inherent link between the object, between human beings that are reduced to an object, but because we are also subjects, we have the capacity to transcend this objectification that we're subject to. So, and he talks about, for example, how there is a struggle over the length of the working day in history, how the capital tries to make us work longer and longer, but inevitably we have to fight back against that because there's only a certain level, obviously, that people can be forced to. So there is a tension that is inevitably there within capitalist society over where labour power is going to go, how much it can be exploited. So Lukács says that this does lead to struggle within society. So although consciousness is what he calls reified, it becomes this. It's turned into a thing, an objectified thing, rather than seen as. So what Marx was talking about before in terms of it's commodities that appear to take on the characteristics of subjects. That's what Lukács is really trying to express. And he says that through struggle, the working class can actually see the eternal laws of capitalism becoming historical and dialectical. So these institutions of capitalist society, the market, the state, and so on, which appear inevitable and natural forms of existence, are historical. And we can only see that by dissolving reification, by dissolving that through actual struggle and realising that we are active practical beings. And bourgeois thought is incapable of grasping this. That's a major section of history and class consciousness, is Lukacs critiquing bourgeois thought, because it can only grasp the social via the idea of isolated individuals. It cannot grasp labour as more than a commodity. It cannot grasp it as the human being. Okay. I'll briefly sum up in a minute. So Lukacs posits the importance of the totality, and this is quite an awkward concept, I think, in Lukacs' work. But I think that will perhaps try to bring out how totality became quite a contested concept in the 20th century. And after the twin figures of Hitler and Stalin, it was deemed to be a totalitarian concept. But I think that Lukacs, in trying to understand that the proletariat can grasp totality by grasping their activity as part of a process. Totality is a critique of the kind of philosophy that Hegel criticised and that reappeared in reformist Marxism, and that by simply looking at the appearance of society or analysing the simple immediate facts, you arrive not at a meaningful knowledge, but at an abstract idea of reality. So by understanding that capitalist society is not a fixed thing, but is a system in flux, driven by contradictions that need to be analysed on the basis of the development at a given time, this can only be grasped by a theory and a class that are driven to go beyond it. So Lukacs, on the one hand, compares reformism, which is aware only of the given situation, and theory for reformism is simply to reflect the working class as it exists. Okay, so it's just simply to bargain with capital. It's not to transform the capital-labour relation. So reformist consciousness focuses only on the immediate interests of struggle. On the other hand to that, you have a kind of utopianism which starts where workers' consciousness ought to be, and when reality fails to match up to that, you end up with pessimistic conclusions that the masses are backwards or whatever. So reformist theory only seeks to reflect what it takes to be the given consciousness of workers, whereas the utopian tries to deduce in theory first what the ideal consciousness would be and work backwards. And revolutionary dialectics is a synthesis of these positions. We must start with the given situation and the immediate interests of what workers are willing to fight for, and through the experience of struggle, it's possible for workers to reach revolutionary conclusions about the nature of capitalist society and the state. It's on this basis that history can be understood as an interaction between the subject and the object. If history is perceived to be a process that takes place outside of human consciousness, this idea that history is a process without subject, for instance, that reappeared in Althusser in the later 20th century, there can be no place for revolutionary strategy. What's the point in organising if history is something that goes on beyond human beings' control? What is Leninism, asked Lukacs in a book in 1926, which he wrote to defend history and class consciousness, if not the permanent insistence on the active and conscious role of the subjective moment? How can one imagine without this Lenin's insistence that insurrection is an art? So I think we've therefore kind of come full circle and demonstrated how the dialectic enables us to grasp the contradictory nature of reality and the potential points of rupture and change. The dialectic is indispensable to us if we are to comprehend the nature and essence of capitalist society behind the given appearance that it takes, and the theorisations of this givenness by bourgeois thought, whether that's the idea that class is irrelevant today, or that it reflects or that capitalist society simply reflects the natural inclinations of man. The capacity to go beyond the merely given and grasp the movement of reality enables Marxists to analyse the real tendencies of the historical movement of society. On the other hand, failure to grasp the dialectic, such as by those in the Second International, saw them continue to posit a gulf and therefore a mechanical relation between the subject on the one hand and objective development on the other. Instead, by reading off their strategy from the appearance of capitalism, revolution and overthrowing the state became unnecessary. Revolutionary dialectic shows us that the contradictions that exist in society cannot be happily resolved, but it does not determine the success of those who want to challenge and overthrow the system. The transformation of those contradictions and crises into successful revolutions that transcend the very system of capital itself requires our side to be more organised than our opponents. Thank you.
Just a question, so I'll be quick. I just wondered if the speaker or I thought maybe other people from the audience might want to start talking about some of the dialectics of nature issues, because on my, the limited understanding on this, Lukacs rejects this, and I think that the focus on the conscious human subject sort of argues against there being a sort of dialectic when you haven't got that kind of human agency at the centre of that. And that can be sort of seen in contradiction to what Engels was writing about when he wrote about the dialectics of nature, and maybe some of this stuff now with the benefits of science and so maybe seems a little naive, but I think from my reading it's an important contribution, and I'd just be interested to hear what people had to say about
that. Just a quick response to the last speaker. I think there was a book published in the last 10 years of something by Lukacs with an introduction by John Rees, which actually said that, clarified the issues, or claimed to, that Lukacs did not actually reject the dialectics of nature. What I was going to say was to start with that, because I don't want to distract from the overall direction of the meeting, because we need to change the planet before, well, we've still got one, but we need to change the system before so we keep planning. Trotsky said that, the speaker spoke about dialectics being the logic of change. Trotsky said dialectics is Darwin, dialectics is evolution. And it's to do with change, and it doesn't just apply to historical change or evolutionary change. It affects the development of the individual. In 1884, there was a famous London doctor called John Hewlings Jackson, who gave a series of lectures called The Evolution and Dissolution of the Nervous System. What he was saying was, if you have a stroke or epilepsy and you seem to be behaving like a baby, it doesn't mean you've reverted to that. What is the overall system, which has changed enormously since you were a baby, is a damaged system. And you have to look at it in that way. And this affected the course of the development of neurology and neuropsychology. And this was developed in the 1920s and 30s onwards by Alexander Luria in Russia. But he was a very bad writer, and his best ideas were actually taken up and written up better by his friend Vygotsky, who really was a dialectical thinker. And I think we have to accept that in terms of its application to change, that in those sciences where change is central to understanding things, dialectics also applies.
I was going to say something about the dialectics of nature because, as a practicing scientist, I think it's inescapable. And I think there is no science that simply describes the static world. So therefore, necessarily, we are dealing with change. We're dealing with predictions about change. We're dealing with models, whether they could be computer models, whether they be physical tests in experiments, in labs and so on. It's all about change, folks. And that's where the problems arise with using the kind of analytical philosophy that has dominated in the West. And particularly for complex systems, which are inherently complex. If you look at just the question of how two cells start to cooperate in an organism, the move from single-celled organisms to diatoms, incredibly critical evolutionary step, if you read Stephen Jay Gould, to understand why it was that it became, there were certain internal changes that needed to take place prior to that being possible, that when they had to develop mitochondrial DNA, they had to develop a whole number of internal structures to be able to collaborate. But this new synthesis allowed the diatoms to evolve into niches that single-celled organisms couldn't do. And there's a lot of ideology in science that when you work in any scientific background, which mitigates against talking about the dialectic. And I think that one of the things that we need to be doing as part of actually painting the big picture and raising people's expectations in our workplaces is actually start talking about the dialectics of nature, because I think it's an incredibly powerful way of thinking about it. And one of the key ways of thinking about it is not simply just talk about the word contradiction, which I think is slightly problematic in terms of how people understand it, is to talk about the interpenetration of opposites. That those two cells interpenetrate each other in their relationship to each other. That they also, that systems involve interpenetration. And that concept, that something can't just exist in isolation, but actually can only really understand it in relation to all of its surroundings and its life cycle and its development and its change, actually is at the heart of the idea of dialectics. And that doesn't require consciousness. Those diatoms are not intellectual. They're not philosophizing about how they would relate to each other. They've evolved to a certain point and then they're able to do so. And the same is true even in the physical world without life. This is not contingent on some kind of divine life spark or anything. Life itself, I would argue, is a dialectical process. It came out of, it evolved out of a dialectical change of something which was able to self-reproduce, change the very nature of itself in that process. Now, that can sound mystical, but the problem is that that's the only kind of material explanation, is actually to say that there isn't an external force, that a divine spark or a prime mover that actually triggers that, but actually something in the chemistry and in the biology, and how the chemistry translates into biology and the evolution of life. So we should have high expectations of what a dialectical explanation can give us, and not a low one. But don't see it as a formalism. You have to look at the facts.
Yes, I totally agree with the previous two speakers have said. And one of the things that are coming out from the meeting is talking about the process in which we look at the way, the Second International, when we talk about the kind of the shift in terms of Marxist understanding post the First World War and October Revolution, is to look at the way that actually, precisely in a way, well, maybe start again very quickly, is to say that one of the reasons that when you have this thing about philosophy, is it the death of philosophy? I think actually it's the situation in which, in a world of capitalism which is changing so dramatically, the very ideas of what natural philosophy constitutes become bigger and bigger and bigger and more precise, and it becomes a massive, if you like, division of labour in terms of ideas. I mean, you've only got to look around the departments of this university to know that we don't just have one single natural philosophy. You've got a whole range of subjects and subdivisions and all the rest of it that constitute, if you like, human knowledge and human experience. So that in itself means that when the idea that, well, is it really philosophic or is it philosophic? Actually, Marx wouldn't have said about, oh, is it philosophic or isn't it philosophic? He said it's scientific. It's called scientific socialism. In a sense, he's already moving into a world in which it's about understanding the world in which we live and how we change the world. So I think that's an important thing to take on board, that Marx is conscious of the changing nature of capitalism as he's writing and as he's developing. It's interesting, for instance, that he says Darwin, a copy of Capital, when Origin of the Species is published, and he writes this and says, what you've done for the natural world, I've attempted in terms of social sciences. Of course, the problem is that actually Darwin, I think, wrote back saying, thank you very much, Mr. Marx, I've never actually got around to opening the book. So that's the nature of what happens in the world. But one of the striking features quickly about the Second International is that kind of pedestrian and kind of prosaic Marxism, a mechanical Marxism that takes place, isn't a product of a kind of lack of understanding of the dialectic that's kind of, oh, we've missed the point somehow down the line. What it really reflects is the degree to which there's an expansion of capitalism in the latter part of the 19th century, the role of German capitalism and how it rises, and the building of the political development within Germany at the time, so that you constitute a mass German socialist party that is massive, infinitely bigger than anything of the Labour Party in this country, and in which people think, yes, we can really change the world by getting the vote, and it becomes a political struggle over the suffrage. And so I think, in a sense, it hijacks away the kind of revolutionary aspect of Marxism and emphasis the idea that actually maybe we won't even have a revolution, we might not even need it. And I am reminded that actually Engels did write a letter to I don't know if it was Kautsky, actually saying that. Now I think maybe on reflection Engels might regretted actually sending it. But that in itself tells you that there is a material dialectic taking place in the world that actually affects the way we think, and that interaction in itself tells us that the experiences of society and the world in which we live are fundamentally dialectical.
I don't. This is quite a lot to take in, so I'm not really going to say anything. But so far the contributions have been really interesting, and thanks Stacey as well, because I learned a lot in the last 15-20 minutes. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about unity of theory and practice, and actually how, because it seems to me that the way you described how Marx, the kind of contributions to the idea of dialectics that Marx and Lenin, Engels and Lenin played, was linked to their analysis of how there was this constant tension between two opposing forces in society, and actually how they try to intervene as well. The idea of how consciousness changes in struggle, and actually how people see the kind of potential to be able to change society in such a massive way through their collective struggle. I found that very interesting, and it's something very similar. I think someone talked about Vygotsky earlier, actually. It's very similar to when you talk about cognitive conflict in kids, when actually they encounter something in science. I'm trained to be a teacher, so you encounter something in your science lesson that actually, they think, oh, where does the water go when the puddle dries? It seeps into the ground. But actually, when they see how water can evaporate, then that contradicts the idea that they had of water and the puddle and the ground in their head. So then they start to think, well, what else could it be? And they have to try and explain that in a new way. Well, actually, I think the reason why this is so important to understand dialectics can be so useful and so important for activists on the ground, is because actually if you want to be able to interpret a situation and be able to think about, well, what are the two, what's the key link in the chain, as we always talk about, what's the key idea, which when we talk about it is going to be what people want to listen and talk to, and actually is something that they will be prepared to be active and campaign on. That's an analysis of the real world that you have to make, and this is where I think it's really useful.
Okay, well mine is just a quick question that's going to come out in a rambly way, because to be honest I didn't understand most of what you said, and it boils down to simple things like understanding what something is, because if you don't understand what the word dialectic actually means in the first place, then actually trying to make sense of what's said about it is next to impossible. And people are using this word in very different ways, so perhaps you could explain to me, is the dialectic a method for analysing history, right? Or is it supposed to be some force in history itself, or something that happens as a result of forces in history? Because people talk about it almost as if it's an object, as if it's a verb, if it's a method, and it's very difficult then, if you're not sure what you're dealing with, to actually make sense of all the theories around it. It seems to me that the forces are the contradictions that occur in reality themselves, not the mysterious dialectic, but sometimes it's hard to tell, so clarification.
Thank you. I wanted to ask two questions, and it's moving forward a bit to dialectical critical realism, which people have been thinking and writing about for the last 30 years. And they make two claims that they're making a new introduction. I wonder if you would agree they aren't new introductions. And one is the idea that absence has been missing from philosophy, and we can't really understand becoming until we think about begoing. And too often people think change means something changes into something different, rather than as a continuity of something that it keeps its substance, but still there's a great transformation as well. They argue that in order to understand that, you have to think about the space that they're coming from, the empty space they're moving into, all the absent possibilities of what they had been, hadn't been, might have been, in order really to understand change. That's one thing. And the other thing they're arguing is that all the time we are confusing things and existence with our thoughts and perceptions, and that seems very obvious, say in interpretive social science and postmodernism. But even with positivists and empirical researchers, they concentrate so much on what they understand about their, quotes, raw data, that they miss the reality of whatever they're observing, and how, as you started off by saying, it existed before they thought about it. And so these people have been suggesting there's a four-part dialectic which begins with the existence of the thing before we step in and start thinking and changing.
I normally try to clarify the dialectic for my students, but I'm going to try and confuse things a bit more, which might depress you. But first I just wanted to make a quick aside about the Russian Revolution. And really it's like how you described perfectly. You can't look at the development of Russia as if it's a thing in itself, isolated from a set of global relationships, which is why you can explain how permanent revolution was possible and to transcend that undialectical view of Kautsky. But then you said there's no iron law of history. Well, actually, of course, then once the Russian Revolution was isolated, that Kautsky's iron law of history did, in the final instance, determine events, because obviously the Russian Revolution failed because it was isolated. So that's in a way a dialectical view. The potential was there, but it was then stifled. But anyway, that's not the point I wanted to make. Now, I wanted to really talk about the problems of the dialectic. Really, going for and the dualism that might be inherent in it. For Hegel's idealistic dialectic, it was fairly simple. Spirit produces matter, and the dialectic of history is matter becoming conscious. That spirit produced it. But these are two intellectual categories. For Hegel, history was a succession of ideas, but they didn't just move in, from a simple succession of one idea to the next. Ideas are in contradiction to each other. So you can explain the movement of history by the contradiction between categories. Now, Marx said in one neat little line, I've turned Hegel's dialectic on its head. Simple as that. So it's now a materialist dialectic. It's a contradiction between material forces, between social structures. However, those are different to ideas. And so there's a problem really, whether before we can even talk about is there dialectic in nature, actually is there a dialectic in material social forces, or are we making a dualistic pattern? First you split the world into two things, nature, society, matter, consciousness, and then you can play all sorts of dialectical games, putting them, in contradiction with each other and emergence. But and then when we look at the dialectic of nature, yes, everything exists in relation to everything else. There's no thing in itself. Everything is formed through relationships and contradiction. And yet, is it simply, when we were talking about the cell earlier, something produces its negation and then changes? Or is everything in relation to... Okay, so just to really mess things up, right? Why just a dialectic? Why just two? Why not a polylectic or a multilectic? And the very, and the clue also, like the word lectic, that's to do with lexicon, that's to do with ideas. That shows it's an inherently idealistic origin. I'm sorry to.
Dialect as well.
I just want to say something about the kind of adventures of the dialectic in the period that Stacey was discussing, from Marx to Lukacs and the Russian Revolution, because to me, the heart of the dialectic is about the way that inherent contradictions can give rise to sudden and explosive transformations that generate something new. And when you put it like that, you can see why anyone that might be interested in revolution might be interested in the dialectic. The comrade earlier talked about Edward Bernstein. When Edward Bernstein set out to say Marx was wrong, the contradictions in capitalism are being reduced, therefore we don't need a revolution, it actually followed, as Rosa Luxemburg pointed out, that he renounced the dialectic and said, really, it's just mystical mumbo-jumbo. Renouncing revolution, he also renounced the dialectic, and it was really Rosa Luxemburg that I think kept the flame of the dialectical method alive. If anyone's ever read, and I really recommend it, her book, The Mass Strike, think about the dialectical method in it, that things that are apparently separate, politics over here, economics over here, in a mass strike, the barriers between the two are dissolved and they become unified in a totality. And think about her point about in the mass strike about workers' consciousness, where you accept capitalism, this rapid, sudden transformation of workers' consciousness to believe they can make a revolution. And I think Lukacs learns the dialectic from Luxemburg and stands on her shoulders, but points out that there's a weakness in her dialectic that blunts it, which is she tended to assume that even in mass struggle, the conservative ideas and power of the trade union bureaucracy will just be swept aside, almost inevitably, and therefore the role of the party was simply political ideas. He said, looking at the commodity fetishism and alienation that Stacey mentioned, that actually for workers to gain access to the reality below the surface of capitalism is actually a much harder task, and that therefore the stranglehold of the bureaucracy who reinforce capitalist ideas is more, there are greater barriers to sweeping that away, and therefore he gives greater weight to the necessity of consciously destroying those barriers, and therefore that people need to organise, the revolutionary minority need to organise not just around ideas, but to actively intervene in the class struggle. And therefore, to me, the dialectic is a method to understand reality, but unless reality itself is dialectically structured, how could that possibly understand reality? But these things aren't separate, because ultimately the people trying to understand that method have to intervene in that reality and become part of the dialectic, because you have to consciously intervene to change reality. We are part of the dialectic.
I'm a doctor, and sometimes I ask myself, if I'm thinking about a problem, how would I approach this dialectically? And what does that mean? Because I feel that there's something going on somewhere that I'm missing. And rather than addressing some problems in medical science, I've just asked myself, we're going through a process now of privatisation, working towards it in the part of the health service I work in, payment by results. But introducing it so every item that you do, you get paid for. The alternative is a block contract, where you simply buy in the whole service. And I can see why both methods might be appropriate to the process of privatisation. I give this to you because I wonder, is there something in that? Is there a way of looking at a problem as something like that will help me to explore it and get something out of it, out of the analysis that will help me to get a better understanding of how to deal with it? Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone that contributed in that discussion. I'll try and answer some of the questions that I feel that I can answer, because there was a lot of sciencey type questions that I don't feel particularly qualified to answer. So there seems to be a theme coming up around the dialectic of nature and whether Lukacs rejects this. I think it's right that in History and Class Consciousness he does tend to focus on the dialectic of society and the relationship between the subject and the object, and that is the main way that he conceives of the dialectic, and which is why he tends to find Engels' understanding of the dialectic of nature quite problematic. And somebody suggested that we look at the later text that Lukacs wrote in 1926, which is called Taylorism and the Dialectic, and I think that book was actually only recently discovered in the last 10 years or so, and because it was thought that after Lukacs wrote History and Class Consciousness, and after it was criticised by Stalin and the philosophers that were known as the Bolshevisers within Soviet society for being idealist and Hegelian or whatnot, it was thought that Lukacs didn't actually seek to defend that, and he kind of apologised for it or whatever. But this book's been discovered, and even as far as 1926, he was still trying to defend this dialectic method and the dialectic analysis of society, and the importance of conscious intervention, which obviously Stalin in practice completely rejected, and with the idea of socialism in one country obviously completely rejected the idea of revolution. But going back to the dialectic of nature, I think in that later text, Lukacs says that he does accept that there's a dialectic of nature, but he thinks it's different to the dialectic of society. So I suppose in a way that's kind of relates to, I think it was the third or fourth speaker who kind of tried to argue that there is a dialectic of nature which is separate to human beings. You know, nature is constantly changing, and there are interpenetrations of opposites in nature as well. So I suppose Lukacs perhaps did support that idea as well. But one of the ways that I personally also understand the dialectic of nature is, on the one hand, to see that separate to human beings, nature does change and is subject to its own internal changes, but that society and nature, there is a dialectic between those two as well. So, for example, our whole analysis, our whole understanding and observation of natural society is shaped by the previous ways that human beings have shaped nature. So, through deforestation, through irrigation, through different ways that we have shaped nature, then changes the objects that we're studying. So that's one way in which it helps me to understand that there is a dialectic in the real world. It's so the question about what is it? I know it's a head-cracking idea, and it's taken me a long time myself to get to grips with what it is. I don't tend to agree with the idea that it's that you can draw a distinction between the method and the system for the reasons that were given, that unless you understand society and the object itself as being dialectical, your method needs to reflect what you're studying. So reality is dialectical, and there are these interpenetrating opposites, like sort of the example I gave with Lenin's analysis of imperialism is kind of having these interpenetrations of opposites between, on the one hand, the imperialist countries and at the other end, the anti-colonial struggles. These things are caused by one another, and they're interpenetrated with one another, but they are contradictory, they are opposites. And dialectics, I think, is a way of kind of trying to understand that, but understanding that these things can't be reconciled with one another in society. Either one will overtake the other. So think about the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. That is understood by Marx to be a dialectical contradiction, and we can't permanently keep those two things in opposition. There's a constant struggle between the two. And hopefully, obviously, the reason why we are organising and creating revolutionary organisations and engaging in struggle is because we actually want to transcend that contradiction, which does exist in reality. Obviously, part of it is our understanding of it too. Okay. I'm not sure what the speaker who tried to kind of suggest that philosophy and science, that maybe Marx kind of replaced philosophy with scientific socialism. I'm not sure if I understand that quite correctly, because I think the whole point that Marx was trying to make is that philosophy is not something outside of human being society, and neither is science. In the 1844 manuscripts, he says that the idea that science is separate to human beings is a priori a lie. Obviously, under capitalist society, science seems to be something that's not, that human beings are separate from. It's an analysis of the object. But actually, science and philosophy are both related in that sense, that they're both seeking to understand the world. And I think what Marx is trying to do is bring these whole things together so that philosophy isn't seen as something separate to practice. And I suppose that brings me on to Chaz's question about the unity of theory and practice, because I think this goes back to how Marx kind of understood what human beings are in the world, I suppose, is that he overcame the idea that had predominated over philosophy before him, that theory and science and philosophy are something separate from activity in the world. Activity in the world is something that is kind of something that the lower classes are almost involved with, that getting their hands dirty and involving themselves in labour. Actually, it's the practical relationship that we have to the world that makes us what we are as human beings. And not only that, but that there's a relationship to our understanding of what is true in reality as well. So Marx talks about how we have to prove the truth of our theories in practice. The only test of a theory is by enacting it in practice, and that goes for the whole way that we understand theory, both science and philosophy, I think. Okay. So practice proves the truth of theory, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. And sorry, is there anything else? I'm afraid the question on dialectical realism was really over my head, so I'm really sorry for the person that wanted some answers on that, but maybe there's someone else here that understands that question a little bit better than me, so apologies to that person. I'm not sure, the person that talked about the Russian Revolution failing because it was isolated, and then the iron laws of history becoming enacted after that process. I'm not sure entirely what that means, because it seems to me that actually the process that after the Russian Revolution became isolated in the Stalinist society, and this idea of socialism in one country, that itself created new contradictions within the Soviet Union, but with the state taking the role of capital, and all the kind of contradictions that leads on from that as well. So I think that there is still a dialectical understanding there that wasn't negated by the failure of the revolution. And I suppose finally the question on Luxemburg, I think that's a really key point. Luxemburg was a great thinker on the dialectic because she put it into practice, the whole way that she understood the potential of the masses to actually organise themselves, but the necessity for independent revolutionaries organising as well. I think so she did have a dialectic between spontaneity and organisation. You know, some people argue that she only valorised spontaneism, but I don't think that's true at all. I think what she grasped was that because of the role of the proletariat in capitalist society, they have the potential through struggle to realise revolutionary ideas without the party bringing it to them from the outside. But actually you need an organisation, an independent organisation, separate from the reformist parties, which unfortunately is something she only came to later on in her life, if you're actually going to transform society itself. So there's a dialectic between the class and the party in that sense, I suppose, as well. I think I'll leave it there.